stillness of night, when sleep feels distant and the mind drifts quietly through forgotten corners of memory, we turn to history, not as numbers or dates, but as echoes, soft, lingering, and unfinished. Tonight we walk gently into one of those echoes, a journey known as the Trail of Tears, America's forced removal of native peoples. It is a story of land and belonging, of families torn from the soil that once held their roots, of grief that moved across rivers and mountains, leaving footsteps heavy with sorrow. But it is also a story of survival, of voices that refuse to fade, and of lessons that still call to us in the present. Here, in this space, we do not rush. We breathe slowly, we listen, we remember. For history is not only about the past, it is about the wounds that remain and the wisdom they whisper to those willing to hear. So let your thoughts settle, let the weight of the day fall away. Stay with us, here at Void Histories, as we follow the quiet path of memory and step softly into the story of the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears, America's forced removal of native peoples. In the beginning, before the storms of history arrived, the land was wide and open, stretching endlessly beneath the sky. The rivers moved gently, like silver threads weaving through forests and valleys. The air was soft, the seasons steady, and the earth felt alive, breathing in harmony with the people who called it home. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole lived here. They were not wanderers. They were nations. They built homes. They planted fields. They told stories that carried wisdom from the old ones to the young. Children learned beneath the shade of tall trees. Elders spoke of ancestors, of spirits in the wind, of lessons hidden in the shape of the mountains and the flow of the rivers. Life was not without hardship. There were seasons of hunger, moments of loss, and times of conflict among tribes. Yet, at its heart, this world was whole. It was a circle, family, land, and spirit bound together. To live was to belong, and to belong was to honor both the earth and one another. When the sun set, fires glowed across the villages. The sound of drums carried softly through the night, echoing across valleys and hills. Laughter of children mixed with the steady rhythm of life. In these moments, there was peace, a deep peace, the kind that sinks into memory and becomes part of identity. The land was not a possession to be bought or sold. It was not a resource to be measured in gold or harvests. It was sacred. Every tree, every river, every stone was part of a larger whole. To the people, the land was alive. It was a parent, a guide, a companion. But peace, no matter how deep, is fragile when others see value in what you hold dear. Beyond the horizon, across oceans, strangers were moving. Strangers who saw the world not as sacred, but as territory. Strangers who measured wealth not in stories or seasons, but in acres and power. At first their presence was distant, like a rumor whispered by the wind. Tales of men with pale faces, ships with tall sails, tools made of shining metal. Some came with curiosity, some came with gifts, some came with words of friendship. Yet beneath those words lay an ambition, a hunger that was not easily satisfied. The harmony of the land did not end in one day. It began with small disturbances, settlers seeking farmland, traders bringing unfamiliar goods, explorers mapping rivers that were already known by the people who lived there. Slowly, the balance began to shift. The native nations could feel it, like the first chill of autumn, a quiet warning that change was coming. They did not yet know how heavy that change would be. They did not yet see the long march ahead, or the tears that would follow. But they sensed it, a trembling beneath the surface. Tonight, as we reflect on this time before the breaking, let us hold that image close. Families gathered in warmth, children dreaming beneath a safe sky, elders speaking of a world full of meaning. This was the beginning. This was the peace that came before. And as the night deepens, we move slowly, gently, into the next part of the story, where the first shadows begin to fall. The peace of the old world did not vanish in a single night. It faded slowly, like mist lifting from the river, replaced by a presence that grew heavier with each passing season. The strangers who had once been only whispers now walked openly across the land. They came in greater numbers: farmers, soldiers, traders, missionaries. Their language was strange, their customs unfamiliar, yet their purpose became clear with time. They did not simply wish to share, they wished to take. At first, there were attempts at friendship. Some native leaders welcomed these newcomers, believing that trade could bring benefits. Iron tools, cloth, and rifles were exchanged for furs, crops, and knowledge of the land. For a while, it seemed possible that two worlds could exist side by side. But harmony requires balance, and balance was not what the newcomers sought. They hungered for land. To them, land was not sacred. It was wealth. It was power. It was something to be owned, fenced, divided, and sold. Where native families saw inheritance and spirit, settlers saw profit and expansion. This difference in vision, sacred trust versus possession, became the seed of conflict. As more settlers arrived, pressure grew. Fields once planted by Cherokee farmers became the target of planters who dreamed of cotton wealth. Forests once used for hunting were cut down to clear new farms. Rivers, once free to flow, were claimed as boundaries. The government, siding with settlers, began to draft policies that pushed native peoples further away from their homelands. The balance of power tilted. Native nations, though numerous, faced the weight of a government determined to expand. The laws of the United States began to overshadow tribal laws. Treaties were written, often with words that seemed fair, but behind those words lay manipulation. Promises of protection, promises of respect, promises that were rarely kept. The pressure was subtle at first, a treaty here, a request there, but each agreement carved away another piece of land. What began as negotiations soon became coercion, and what began as promises of coexistence turned into demands of removal. The Cherokee, known for their diplomacy and adaptation, attempted to live alongside the settlers by building towns, schools, and even adopting aspects of American governance. They believed that by showing their ability to adapt, they would be allowed to remain. But adaptation was not enough. For settlers, it was not a matter of coexistence. It was a matter of possession. The Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole faced similar struggles. Year after year, they watched as their homelands were chipped away, as their sovereignty was challenged, as their dignity was tested. For every negotiation, there was disappointment. For every treaty, there was betrayal. Conflict grew not only in words, but also in spirit. Distrust spread, resentment deepened, and beneath the surface, anger burned quietly, waiting for its moment to break. Families who once lived in certainty now lived with fear. Would their homes still be theirs tomorrow? Would their children inherit the land, or would they inherit only stories of what was lost? In this time, the future was uncertain, but one thing became clear. Peace could not survive in the face of endless hunger for land. The harmony that once stretched across valleys and forests was now fractured, piece by piece. The storm had not yet reached its full strength, but the clouds had gathered, and so the nation stood at a threshold. Behind them was the memory of peace. Before them, the shadow of struggle. The first conflict had begun, not with a single battle, but with the slow, suffocating weight of power pressing down, reshaping lives, and preparing the way for even greater sorrow. As night deepens, we move forward in this story toward resistance, toward struggle, and toward the first wars that would rise from these wounds. When the weight of a loss became too heavy, the nations could no longer remain silent. The earth beneath their feet still carried the memory of ancestors, and that memory demanded protection. To surrender without struggle would be to erase not only land, but identity itself. So resistance began. For the Cherokee, resistance first took the form of words. They turned to courts, believing that justice might still be found within the law of the newcomers. They argued that treaties must be honored, that sovereignty was their right, that the promises given should not be broken. For a brief moment, it seemed their voices might be heard. In one famous case, the highest court in the United States acknowledged their right to remain, to govern themselves, to live on their ancestral lands. But even decisions of law could be bent by politics. A ruling on paper could not stop soldiers on the ground. The voice of justice was quieted by the louder voice of power. Elsewhere, resistance carried a different shape. The Seminole, in the swamps and forests of Florida, fought not with papers but with fire and determination. They knew the land intimately, the rivers, the marshes, the hidden trails. Soldiers sent to remove them found themselves entangled in unfamiliar terrain, facing warriors who would not yield. The Seminole Wars became some of the most difficult conflicts for the U.S. military, a reminder that the will to survive could not be easily crushed. The Creek, too, rose in defiance, defending their villages against encroaching settlers. They fought to preserve not only their land, but their way of life, even as they faced overwhelming odds. Every battle carried the echoes of desperation, of love for homeland, of grief turned into courage. But resistance, no matter how fierce, carried a heavy price. For every moment of defiance, there was retaliation. Villages were burned, fields were destroyed, families scattered. Children and elders caught between armies suffered most of all. The struggle was uneven, like a fragile flame against a storm. Still, the nations fought, because to remain silent was to vanish. In these years of conflict, blood was spilled on both sides. Yet, the imbalance was always clear. The government's forces grew stronger, supplied with weapons, resources, and endless reinforcements. Native warriors fought bravely, but their numbers dwindled. Each act of resistance was met with greater force. Each victory was followed by a deeper loss. And still, even as the wars raged, diplomacy continued. Leaders of native nations tried to negotiate, to reason, to find a path that did not end in destruction. They carried themselves with dignity, even as their options narrowed. They spoke not only for themselves but for generations unborn, for the children who might one day ask why their people no longer walked the lands of their ancestors. The First War was not a single event, but a pattern, a rhythm of defiance and suppression, of courage and sorrow. It revealed the deep fracture between two worlds, one that saw land as sacred, and another that saw it as territory to conquer. It was a war not only of weapons, but of visions, of values, of what it meant to belong to the earth. When the smoke cleared, when the battles quieted, the nations had not truly lost their spirit, but they had lost much else: lives, villages, fields, and the fragile hope that law or diplomacy alone might protect them. Resistance had proven their strength, but also revealed the depth of the storm they faced. And so, with weary steps, they entered the next chapter, a chapter where wars would continue, where treaties would follow, and where each attempt at peace would carry the sting of betrayal. The path ahead was narrowing, and the road was beginning to darken. As we move deeper into this story, let us hold in our hearts the image of those who resisted. The warriors in the swamps, the leaders in the courts, the families who endured, their struggle was not in vain. It was a testament to dignity, to courage, and to the unbroken will of a people who refused to vanish without a fight. The wars did not end quickly. They came in waves, each one leaving behind broken lives, shattered villages, and weary hearts. When swords and rifles grew silent, another weapon appeared: paper, ink, and treaties written in cold language. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 stood like a shadow over all negotiations. It declared, with the authority of law, that native peoples must leave their lands east of the Mississippi River. To those who passed it, it seemed like policy. To those who lived under it, it was exile. It was the breaking of ties that reached back centuries. The Choctaw were among the first to feel the weight of this law. In 1831, they signed a treaty that forced them to leave their homelands in Mississippi. The government promised supplies, protection, and safe passage. But promises, once again, proved fragile. The journey west was marked by hunger, disease, and death. Survivors arrived in strange lands with nothing but grief and memory. The Creek followed, then the Chickasaw, each nation compelled to sign treaties that read like sentences, not agreements. The Seminole resisted with strength, refusing to leave Florida, fighting a long and bitter war. Some were captured, some were killed. Others fled deep into the swamps, where descendants still live today, holding on to fragments of their ancestral world. The Cherokee held out the longest. They fought with law, with diplomacy, with appeals to morality. They reminded the government of its own rulings, of its own constitution. For a while, their defiance gave hope. But in 1835, a small group, not truly representing the Cherokee people, signed the Treaty of Nuakota. This treaty, though opposed by most of the Cherokee Nation, gave the government what it wanted: a legal excuse to begin removal. Treaties in these years were not instruments of peace. They were instruments of power. Signed under pressure, carried out under threat, they stripped nations of their land piece by piece. Each new agreement was framed as the end of conflict, yet in truth, each one opened the door to more sorrow. The wars that led to these treaties were not fought only with weapons. They were fought with starvation, with forced marches, with the destruction of crops and homes. It was a strategy of exhaustion. Wear the people down until they could no longer resist, then present them with paper to sign. For the families caught in the middle, treaties felt like chains written in ink. Parents told their children to remember their homelands, even as they prepared to leave them. Elders wept as they touched the earth for the last time, carrying soil in their hands, hoping to bring a piece of it with them to the West. The government, in its speeches, spoke of civilization and progress. But for the native nations, progress meant loss. Civilization meant erasure. What was presented as policy was, in truth, a slow and deliberate dismantling of a people's world. The painful irony was that many of these nations had already adopted elements of American life. They had farms, schools, written constitutions. They had tried to coexist, to show that they could live side by side with settlers. Yet coexistence was not what the settlers wanted. They wanted land, and land could only be made available by removing those who stood upon it. By the late 1830s, the treaties had done their work. The Cherokee, despite all resistance, were finally forced to march. The journey that followed would be remembered as the Trail of Tears. But the story of that march belongs to the next chapter. For now, we rest in the silence between wars and treaties, hearing the quiet despair of nations who signed documents not because they believed in them, but because the alternative was annihilation. And so, the wars bled into treaties, and treaties bled into exile. Each step forward for one side meant devastation for the other. The balance was gone, the harmony broken. All that remained was the long road ahead, stretching into the west, carrying with it sorrow, loss, and the fading hope of return. As the night deepens, we now move into the heart of the tragedy, the wounds of society, the broken families, and the generations that would carry this grief long after the treaties were signed. The march westward began with footsteps heavy in sorrow. It was not a single road, but many, spreading across rivers, mountains, and plains. Yet all of them carried the same weight, the same grief, the same relentless name, the Trail of Tears. Families walked for miles each day, their belongings reduced to what they could carry on their backs. Mothers held children close, whispering songs to soothe them even as hunger hollowed their faces. Fathers tried to guide their families forward, step by step, though their own strength faltered. The elderly, who once sat by fires telling stories of ancestors, struggled to keep pace. Many could not. They collapsed on the road, their voices silenced before reaching the west. Winter deepened the suffering. Snow fell, winds cut through thin clothing, and shelters were scarce. Promises of food and supplies often failed to arrive, leaving people to starve on the frozen earth. Some tried to warm themselves with small fires, yet the fires could not protect against the endless march. For every mile, lives were left behind, graves dug quickly, marked by nothing more than a memory. The numbers are staggering. Thousands upon thousands did not survive. But beyond numbers, there is the human ache. The mother who buried her child and kept walking. The child who reached the west but with no parents left to guide them. The elders who carried the pain of knowing they would never see their homelands again. What was lost was not only life, but continuity. Stories, songs, and traditions that should have passed from one generation to the next were cut short. Languages weakened, broken by distance, by grief, by forced assimilation in the years that followed. Entire generations grew up far from the lands that had shaped their ancestors, far from the rivers and mountains that had carried meaning for centuries. The trauma was not only physical, it was spiritual. To be torn from the land was to be torn from identity. For Native nations, the earth was not just ground to walk upon, it was memory, it was belonging, it was the thread that tied the living to those who had gone before. Without it, many felt hollow, unmoored, as if drifting through history with no anchor to hold them. Yet even within the sorrow, there were fragments of resilience. Families held on to what they could, songs whispered on the march, stories repeated so they would not be forgotten, seeds of tradition carried westward in the hope that they might still grow. The pain did not erase identity. It scarred it, changed it, but it could not fully destroy it. Still, the scars ran deep. Children born after the removal grew up carrying a grief they did not fully understand. They inherited silence, the silence of parents who could not speak of what they endured, the silence of elders who wept when asked about the old homelands. These children belonged to what we might call the lost generations, those who knew their people had once lived differently, more freely, but who could no longer touch that world. This silence was passed down, echoing across decades. Trauma became memory, and memory became a quiet companion to every new generation. The wounds of the Trail of Tears were not confined to those who walked it. They lived on in the hearts of descendants, shaping identity, shaping history, shaping the quiet grief that still lingers today. When we look back, it is easy to see the Trail of Tears as a chapter of the past, bound to the 1830s, but in truth, its weight extends far beyond. It is felt in the stories told today, in the resilience of Native peoples who still fight for recognition, for dignity, for healing. It is felt in the reminder that human suffering, once inflicted, does not vanish when the march ends. It echoes, it lingers, it shapes generations yet unborn. And so, as we walk gently through this story, we carry the image of those footsteps, endless, heavy, and sorrowful. The march did not end with the road, it continued in the hearts of those left behind and in the silent inheritance of those yet to come. Now, as night deepens, we move toward the final part of this tale, a reflection on what remains and what lessons this tragedy still whispers to us today. When we look back upon the Trail of Tears, we are not only looking at a single road or a single march through wilderness and storm, we are looking at the breaking of bonds between people and their land, between generations and their past, between memory and the soil that once held it. The tragedy was not just the loss of homes or the loss of lives, though those losses were countless. The deeper wound was the attempt to erase a people's place in the world, to tear them from the earth that gave them identity, and to declare that they no longer belonged. And yet, against all of this, the nations endured. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, they survived. They carried with them what could not be stolen: their spirit, their language, their traditions, their sense of belonging to one another. Even scarred, even displaced, even broken by grief, they lived. That survival is not a small thing. It is not quiet acceptance. It is resilience. It is resistance in its most enduring form. For to exist, after being told again and again that you should disappear, is itself an act of defiance. Today, their voices are still here. Their communities still gather. Their languages are still spoken. Their ceremonies still carried out. Though the Trail of Tears carved a wound into history, it did not silence the nations who walked it. They remain, not as shadows of the past, but as living people in the present. And for us, listening now, there is a lesson. History is not just dates and laws. It is not only battles and treaties. History is memory. Memory carried in bodies, in families, in communities. Memory that does not vanish when the books close, but that continues to echo in the present moment. The Trail of Tears reminds us of what happens when power sees people not as human beings, but as obstacles. It reminds us of the danger of greed disguised as progress, and of how fragile dignity becomes when weighed against ambition. But it also reminds us of strength, the quiet strength to survive, the quiet courage to endure, the quiet resilience to rebuild, even when everything has been taken. When we close our eyes and imagine that long march, we may feel sorrow. We may feel grief for what was done, for lives lost, for generations wounded. But perhaps we may also feel a deeper call to remember, to listen, and to carry forward the truth of what happened. For memory, if honored, becomes a guide. It prevents forgetting. It prevents silence. It prevents the same wounds from being repeated. As night deepens, let us sit with this story not as an ending, but as a meditation. The Trail of Tears is not only about removal, it is about survival. It is not only about loss, it is about resilience. And it is not only about the past, it is about what we choose to carry into the future. May we carry empathy. May we carry remembrance. May we carry the voices of those who walked, those who endured, those who survived. For they are still here. Their footsteps still echo. Their story is still alive. And so, as this tale comes to a close, let us rest in its quiet weight. A sorrow remembered, a people unbroken, a lesson for all who choose to listen,